Hello EDU 304 and welcome to Module 3, which is going to be focused on feedback and the importance of both sides of this feedback coin, the giving as well as the receiving. When we talked through your D2 disposition rubrics at midterm, this was one area that came up in most of our conversations. How accepting are you as a human being when you receive feedback? But then also, the other side of that, how engaged are you in giving appropriate feedback to others? We recognize that the teaching career is a highly socially dynamic career, at least most times when students are actually in our buildings and we're teaching them face-to-face rather than an online forum. And feedback is an important part of this social dynamic and relationship. So a couple of questions to consider when we get into feedback. First of all, what is it? Why is it important? And how can it help students? And so I thought today we would begin with a non-example of appropriate feedback. Most of the time when we think about modeling for students, giving them examples of how something's done, we give them an appropriate example, but non-examples can also be powerful methods of instruction. And so I'm going to go ahead and play a short video clip from American Idol. I'm going to apologize beforehand for the sound quality as it's echoey and a little bit difficult to hear at times. But I'm going to go ahead and show you about 2 minutes worth of a clip here. The Best of Simon in American Idol.
I don't know what cats being squashed sound like in Lithuania, but I now have a pretty good idea. I mean, sorry, Bill. No, but Emma, you can't sing.
Well, I think I can. But I just think you should give us a chance.
But a chance to do what?
To improve.
Yeah, girls, we have weeks, not decades. If you think for 1 second I'm going to put you through so you can stick fingers in certain parts of your body in front of the royal family, you can think again. No, girls, you sounded like 3 cats being dragged up the motorway. It was just awful. You know, and to compare yourself with the Spice Girls, it's just crazy. Last year I described someone as being the worst singer in America. I think you're possibly the worst singer in the world, based on that performance. And I'm absolutely serious. I've never, ever heard anything like that in my life. Ever. No, but Keith, you've got to hear yourself to believe it. There is nobody on this planet who sings like you. Have you all got colds? I mean, that was a racket, wasn't it? Right, Holly, your mouth is far, far too big when you sing. I mean, it was like looking into a cave. I've never seen anything so huge in my life. And because your mouth is so big, this weird noise sound comes out of it. It was absolutely terrible. That song was like, it was like going to a zoo or something. I mean, the noises, it was beyond anything I've ever heard. I'm not being rude, Nathan. I mean, when you joined in and started screaming at her...
I haven't sold 180 copies for no reason.
180 copies, Simon. And no one's returned them?
No.
Stephen, I mean, I've heard some weird auditions in my life, but I've got to tell you, that is possibly the weirdest I've ever heard in my life. I mean, it was like a 1-year-old singing that song.
Ooh,
No, I'm not being harsh, Stephen. That's what it was like. I mean, it was weird.
Oh, I'm also a little off practice as well, too. I mean, the last time I took formal lessons was back in high school. All right?
And what did the instructor say?
Back then, I was getting all A's in concert choir.
Back then, I was getting all A's in concert choir. So, as clearly visible, Simon might be accurate in some of his assessment and some of his feedback. Certainly, I don't advocate that you are as cruel as he is. But I want to think about that last participant in particular. For some reason in his mind, based on the A's that he was receiving in concert choir, there seems to be a mismatch between his expectation of success and reality based upon his evaluator, who in this case is Simon. Let me give you another example, okay? A non-example, rather, of appropriate feedback. And this comes from a wonderful blog and podcast called The Cult of Pedagogy that I would encourage all of you to follow. They're half-hour-long podcast episodes by a woman who is not in the ivory tower of university teaching, but she's an on-the-ground, real-life teacher speaking to real-life teachers. So it'd be a wonderful resource for you to check out, especially if you have time. Maybe you're going for a walk as the weather becomes nice, you're working out in some way, you're driving and commuting. But here's what she says, and I think this is another good non-example to get us thinking about the power of appropriate feedback. She says this: "Once or twice a week I take this cardio weight class at my gym. And every time I go, I usually reach a point where I'm sure I'm about to pass out, throw up, or both. Even though I hate it, I also kind of like it. It feels good to be pushed to your limit. One day we had a substitute instructor. Let's call her Kayla. She was about 22, pretty blonde, thin. Our regular instructors were definitely older, like most of us in the class, but whatever. I thought the age difference might be a good thing. Maybe she'd be extra tough on us. But she wasn't. Class that day was remarkably, disappointingly easy and slow. For the first time, I didn't even break a sweat. But here was the worst part. Near the end, as we completed a tedious sequence of leg lifts that were so easy one woman was actually texting while she did them, Kayla shouted out, 'You ladies are amazing!' Really? Amazing? For a moment I felt like a very old woman, like I was taking a samba class at some retirement home, feebly shuffling through the moves while my vibrant young teacher encouraged me towards some sad personal best, a feat that would certainly earn me some hot cocoa and a nap afterward. What I didn't feel was motivated or amazing. What's wrong with amazing, she asks, or phenomenal, or any other superlative we throw around 100 times a day? Sometimes there's nothing wrong with them. Sometimes they just help us express emotion. If you're starving and you just took your first bite of a fresh hot burrito, phenomenal might be the only way to describe that burrito. That's not a problem. It certainly won't bother the burrito. But if you're trying to motivate someone, a student for instance, an employee, your child, calling them amazing won't pump them up the way you hope it will. Not in any lasting way. What's worse, it could actually have the opposite effect. Back when American Idol had its original lineup of judges, you could pretty much script how it would go when a contestant finished singing. First, Randy Jackson said something vague and awkwardly hip. The contestant responded with a kind of wince. Next, Paula Abdul rhapsodized about the singer's complete and utter perfection. Most contestants looked grateful at this point, but there was something else there too. Impatience. A restlessness to get it over with because Paula's feedback didn't carry any weight. When she finally finished and it was time to turn to Simon, the contestant would take a deep breath, and every single time their expression changed. This is the one that counts. Although Simon's review was usually critical, and far too often it was unnecessarily cruel, it actually meant something to the contestants. Everyone likes a pat on the back, but having someone call you amazing when you know you hit a ton of wrong notes, it just feels wrong. And if you're handing out amazings like peanuts at a bar, pretty soon no one's really interested in your opinion. And so I share both of these examples with you to sort of get your mind in gear a little bit, to get thinking a little bit about two questions that I have for you, or rather two examples. And so at this time I'd ask you to pull up the feedback note sheet, which you can access over on the right-hand side of Module 3 on MyUSF. And this is a 2-pager, and feel free, because it's a Word document, to expand the boxes as much as you need to. This is really for your benefit. And then you're going to upload this just like you have in the past under coursework in order to sort of get an engagement grade for the day and for me to see that you're following along in a timely manner. But the question that I have for you up at the beginning is, what are 2 potential problems with the feedback "You ladies are amazing"? I'd like you to take a moment to think through 2 potential problems with this phrase, given the context of the story that we've just heard. And then I'd like you to fill in the blanks on the top of your graphic organizer. Go ahead and pause this video, and then simply resume it as soon as you have completed with that. Okay. 2 other potential problems with "You ladies are amazing." Now, there are a number of things that I would be concerned of as a parent, as an athletic coach, or as a teacher with this phrase given this context. The first is that amazing is unspecific feedback. The author of this brief article isn't sure what part of her is amazing, and because she herself recognizes that she's exerting much less effort than she normally does, she doesn't particularly feel amazing. And when her feeling, the reality of the situation, conflicts with the feedback that she's getting, she's going to be unreceptive to that feedback, and it's ultimately not really going to help her in any way. The second major problem I see is that this feedback is praising the person, or the people rather. "You ladies are amazing." We're praising them as people, as individuals, as human beings, rather than the effort that as an aerobics instructor she's supposed to be assessing. Right, and so we need to be careful about this in the classroom context as well, that we're not praising the person. All of our students are good human beings that are worthy of our respect. But when we give feedback, we want to be very specific that we are praising the effort or the quality of the work, not the person themselves. Here's the second thing I'd like you to do. Please pause this video, and I'd like you to access the article, The Learning Myth. It's a brief 1.5-page article written by the founder of the Khan Academy. And it's kind of controversial in the sense that the subtitle for this is "Why I'll Never Tell My Son He's Smart." And initially this seems like a very heartless sort of title. But I'd like you to read through it prior to moving on to the rest of today's lesson, so that it can build us some sort of understanding and context as we move forward. So go ahead, pause the video, and then join me again once you have finished reading through it. So you've read through this article, The Learning Myth, "While I'll Never Tell My Son He's Smart." And you recognize that in spite of this, Saul is not a bad parent. As a matter of fact, what he's advocating is a growth mindset, where you're praising the effort of a child, persevering through difficulty, rather than necessarily praising the product at the back end of this. This is a situation that I've experienced firsthand when I've worked with gifted or high-achieving students. Oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes these students are so they're so identified with their label as gifted or high ability or advanced, that almost impedes their willingness to take risks. Because when they take a risk, then they might not naturally be excellent at whatever it is they're doing. And so it was important for me as their instructor to let them know that they were being challenged in new and unique ways. And when I gave them feedback, I was providing the feedback to the product, not the person. So as we move forward with this, our objective for today is this. I would like you to be able to leave this lesson being able to identify and distinguish between the 4 major types of appropriate classroom feedback. Certainly there are more types of feedback than the 4 we're going to cover today. Just as there are more versions of rubrics than the 3 in the checklist, the 4 rubrics we covered in our rubric module. But I think this is a good start to begin thinking about ways that you might interact with your students in the K-12 classroom. A quote that struck me: "A teacher has the distinct responsibility to nurture a student's learning and to provide feedback in such a manner that the student does not leave the classroom feeling defeated. Even if your students aren't able to do the task at hand, you want to generate hope within them, that they're not defeated, that they don't give up. But on the flip side of that, you also don't want them to leave your classroom inflated." See, sometimes our feedback can be too harsh, and our children, our students, our friends leave the conversation feeling defeated. But oftentimes, as is the case in the story that we just read, our feedback can be too hopeful, too optimistic, unrealistically positive. And that's also dangerous, because then our students, our children, our friends can leave our conversation being too inflated with an unrealistic belief or expectation about their ability. In other words, we need to balance the Paula and the Simon as we provide feedback to our students. So what are the major methods of feedback? Go ahead and turn again to your graphic organizer or your feedback note sheet, and let's go through several of the most common methods. The first is verbal feedback. And this happens best in a one-on-one conversation with a student. Another way that you might provide feedback to students in the K-12 classroom is in a written or symbolic form. This could be in the guise of written comments that are on a paper or a rubric, or maybe you're just writing a sticky note and you're putting that down on a student's desk. I'd sometimes use that as a behavior management strategy. I'd see a student who's kind of being disrupted, maybe not raising their hand, maybe bothering some students near them, and I might just, as I'm teaching, as I'm walking through the classroom between the aisles of the desks, I might just jot a note, a corrective sort of note on a sticky, and then I just discreetly put it on that student's desk so that they could read it and they could recognize, oh, okay, all right, Berg's providing me with some feedback. I'm going to adjust my behavior accordingly. We can also provide feedback via video or recording. Maybe a student submits a project or a performance and you're able to send them back personalized verbal type of communication. Of course, they won't be able to ask questions and interact with you, but it allows you, rather than just doing this in writing, to actually communicate verbally or via video with the student. Another way that I would try to manage behaviors in my classroom is through physical proximity. So there are ways that we can provide feedback that's nonverbal or physical. Maybe it's a certain facial expression. Maybe it's that certain look in your eyes that you shoot towards a certain student when they've interrupted you or they bothered another classmate. Maybe it's body language. Maybe you're asking students to communicate thumbs up, thumbs down. Maybe it's simply proximity. When I see that there's a group that's not as focused on the learning as they need to be, and I simply just move my body without saying anything a little bit closer to them. There's a natural sort of assessment of their ability to work, and that encourages them to focus more on the learning. Maybe we're able to encourage students to offer feedback to one another via peer review or pair share. And then finally, we're able to provide feedback to students through modeling. One way that I would do this is, because I never really stayed at a job in a school district long enough to not be evaluated by the principal, I would always have principals, assistant principals, academic coaches, other instructors who would come into my classroom, and they would provide me with feedback, and I would use that to model for my students areas of strength, areas of improvement, and how I would use that feedback to try to change or adapt my instructional methods. So when we think about feedback, there are a few aspects that we need to make sure that our feedback includes or encompasses. The first and most important is that our feedback is clear. That was the problem, or one of the problems, with the "you ladies are amazing" feedback. It wasn't clear. The writer was unsure which aspect, if any, of her performance was quote-unquote amazing. And so we need to make sure, especially if we're working with younger learners, that we're not we're not littering too much teacher lingo into our feedback, but we're providing feedback that our students are able to clearly understand. The second is that feedback needs to be timely. If we wait any longer than 5 instructional days, then our students have already moved beyond whatever it is we were asking them to do and providing feedback on. Now, I'm as guilty as any other English teacher that early on in my career, I would collect 120 essays, and I might not give those back to the students until 3 weeks later. Well, at that point, the students might go through and read my comments, but they've already moved on. They've forgotten that activity, that assignment. They have no real way to make improvements or to display growth or further understanding in that area. And so what I recognize is that my feedback was not timely. One of the requirements for administrators in the Sioux Falls School District, I learned this when I was doing my administrative internship, is that anytime they evaluate a teacher, they're required to communicate their results or their feedback to the teacher within 5 school days. Because it's that same sort of idea that if they wait until the end of the semester or the end of the school year, the teacher has no ability to implement changes and make improvements. The feedback needs to be timely. The feedback needs to be specific. Focus on the 1 or the 2 specific areas that you see the student struggling with the most, or the couple of areas that you see them succeeding in the most, but make it specific rather than some sort of vague kind of, oh, this is an excellent performance, or this is an excellent project. Our feedback ought to be limited, in that we don't want to overwhelm our students by marking down every error that we might see. Okay, we need to be limited and specific to what is most important for their success in whatever the particular unit or lesson or assignment is that we're assessing. We want our feedback to be goal-oriented. In other words, you've listed some sort of objective, some sort of goal, some sort of target you're expecting students to meet, and we want to always focus our feedback towards that. Rather than you subjectively just making up some kind of goal for the students, reiterate the goal that you had for every student at the beginning of the activity. And then finally, the focus of feedback should be student-centered. It's centered upon the students' learning and their ability to grow and succeed. So now I want to transition into the 4 major types of feedback, and I ask that you just take as many notes as are appropriate in those boxes that I provided in the note sheet. The first type of feedback is what we refer to as descriptive feedback. And what this feedback is doing is exactly what its name or its title implies. It's giving descriptive comments about what is seen. And so, in other words, there's no evaluation tied to this. As a teacher, you're simply describing to the student what it is you're seeing in their project or their product or their performance. It isn't empty praise. It describes the things you're able to see or hear or not hear or experience by looking at the work. It's often in the form of a question. And so rather than telling students you need to do this, you need to speak louder in your presentation, you might note that it was difficult to hear you at points. How do you think this impacts the way other students were able to understand your presentation? See, you're driving at certain important points, but you're not explicitly telling the students what they need to do or change. You're asking them to sort of self-reflect by simply describing as a fly on the wall whatever it is that you're observing. This is my favorite form of feedback as an administrator or when I go into classrooms for student-teacher residence. I like to simply describe what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing, what I'm witnessing from the students around me, and then push it on to my teacher to reflect upon what that means and what changes they might need to implement. Descriptive feedback is linked to the learning that's expected. The question correlated to that is, where am I going? Well, I'm going towards the goal, the objective, the learning target, the standard. Descriptive feedback addresses faulty interpretations and lack of understanding. In other words, it's asking, how am I going to get my students where I want them to go? And finally, descriptive feedback provides students with visible and manageable next steps. What do the students need to do to improve to get where you want them to go? The second type of feedback is perhaps the one you think about most often when you hear the word feedback, and that is corrective feedback. Feedback that's corrective in nature. You're revealing to students how they need to correct their mistakes. And we want to do this over the assignment objective. So we're not necessarily correcting their behavior, their approach, but we're relating this to whatever those objectives are. This is important. You might think that after sharing the non-example assignment and that maybe we should never tell students if they're doing something wrong. That's not what I'm driving at all. We need to do so, but we need to do so with love and grace and kindness. But it's important, I think, about history. It's important that your students are pronouncing names correctly, they're understanding the dates and the time periods correctly. In math, it's important that students are getting the correct answer, right? There are certain subjects and certain times in every subject where the answer is black or white. 2 + 2 = 4. And if a student, like my 4-year-old son, says that it's 5, then I need to correct him. Because otherwise, I'm not helping him. I'm sort of allowing that mistake to solidify in his thinking because by negligence, I have not addressed that student's mistake. The third type of feedback is evaluative feedback. And this is feedback that gives students an evaluation. Oftentimes, this is in the form of a grade or a score or a symbol or a mark or a star or a smiley or something like that. And so this evaluates how students did in relation to some sort of scoring scheme, whether that be a rubric, a checklist, the standards, whatever the case might be. And then finally, our final type of feedback for this lesson is praise. Now, praise is important, but praise needs to be done appropriately. Okay? It shouldn't be empty in the terms of the story we saw at the beginning of this lesson. You ladies are amazing. Now that praise isn't accurate and isn't appropriate. Praise should be focused, it should be practical, and based on an assessment of what the students can do or cannot do, and what the student is capable of achieving. It's really important that the praise confirms the student's own sense of reality. Because if you're telling them they're amazing, but they're not feeling amazing, they're going to read through your feedback. It needs to be realistic. Okay, if you're on the basketball court, and I used to coach 7th grade boys basketball, it's not appropriate me to praise a student and compare them to LeBron James or say that I would give them a scholarship to go play Division I basketball or something like that. The praise needs to be confined and realistic to the situation and the abilities of your students. And keep this in mind. Praise is not a bad thing. But oftentimes, especially those of us wired by nature to go into elementary ed, oftentimes we engage in excessive praise. And research has shown that excessive praise often does more harm for students than it does good. So acknowledge the students and the efforts they are making. And this goes a long way to positively influencing academic performance. Be realistic. And again, we're not praising the person, we're praising the product. We're praising the effort behind it. Be sure to praise the effort or the work, not the person. As we end this lesson today, I just wanted to share an excerpt with you from a book I read a couple of years ago. The book's called A Higher Loyalty, and it's a sort of memoir written by James Comey, who for a period of time was director of the FBI. Until he was removed from that post by President Trump. And I don't share this with any sort of political motivation. As a matter of fact, the excerpt I'm going to share has to do with when James Comey was working in another business prior to the FBI. But I think what's important here is his focus or his company's focus on feedback, okay? So here's what he says. Before I became director of the FBI, I worked at Bridgewater Associates, which aspires to build a culture of complete transparency and honesty. I learned there that I could sometimes be selfish and a poor leader. Most often, that was because I was hesitant to tell people who worked for me when I thought they needed to improve. The best leaders are both kind and tough. Without both, people don't thrive. Bridgewater's founder, Ray Dalio, believes there is no such thing as negative feedback or positive feedback. There is only accurate feedback. And we should care enough about each other to be accurate. By avoiding hard conversations and not telling people where they were struggling and how they could improve, I was depriving them of the chance to grow. My squeamishness was not only cowardly, it was selfish. If I really care about the people who work for me, if I create the atmosphere of deep personal consideration I want, I should care enough to be honest, even if it makes me or them uncomfortable. I should, of course, still consider the best way to deliver the message. There's a right time and a right way for every conversation. If someone's mom just died, that is not the day to be accurate. But I was honor bound to find a way to have that conversation. So as I leave you today to upload your note sheet under coursework, I want you to consider the reality or the accuracy of the feedback you provide. If you're able to create a supportive environment in your classroom where students know that they are valued and respected because they're children of God, because they're humans and by nature that's their right, then the feedback that you provide doesn't have to squash them or inflate them. Rather, it's seen as an accurate way to reassess and adjust their behaviors or their work ethic or their abilities in the classroom. Have a great rest of the day. I will see you again for day 2 of our feedback module, where we'll actually get into providing some feedback based on student examples. Take care, everyone.